The first settlements in what is now Switzerland date back to ancient times. Archaeological findings prove that humans started living in this region around 150,000 years ago. The first known traces date back to the Neanderthals, who roamed the region as hunter-gatherers during the Paleolithic period, and stone tools, bone remains, and campsites from this period have been discovered in various places, especially in caves and sheltered rocky outcrops that served as temporary shelters. With the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago, the climate changed dramatically, which favored permanent settlement in the region, and during the Mesolithic period human groups began to settle more frequently in specific locations, living mainly by hunting, fishing, and gathering plants. Remains of these early communities have been found, especially along rivers and lakes. The Neolithic period saw a significant change as people became sedentary and began to practice agriculture and animal husbandry, as evidenced by the remains of settlements such as the famous stilted dwellings on Lake Constance, Lake Zurich, and other bodies of water. These pile dwellings, built on wooden stilts above the water, offered protection from moisture and enemies. With the increased use of metals in the Bronze Age and later in the Iron Age, society developed further. Trade relations with other parts of Europe developed and more complex communities emerged. The Celtic Helvetii in particular played a central role in the early history of Switzerland. They inhabited large parts of the country and were an important part of Europe's cultural and economic network, and the early colonization of Switzerland shows that the region was an important habitat for various cultures for thousands of years. The traces of these early people can still be seen today in the form of archaeological towns, artifacts, and cultural remains, giving an insight into the long history of human presence in this alpine landscape. The Roman period began in what is now Switzerland in 58 BC, when the Roman Empire expanded its dominance in the region, and the Roman general Gaius Julius Caesar defeated the Helvetic Celtic tribe, who had earlier tried to migrate westward in the Gallic Wars. Following their defeat, they were forced to return to their original settlements and submit to Roman rule. In the years that followed, the area that is now Switzerland was integrated into the Roman Empire and administratively included in the provinces of Gallia Belgica, later Germania Superior and Rhaetia, and the Romans built numerous towns, fortified military camps, and a well-developed road network to control and economically develop the region. Important Roman settlements included Augusta Raurica, near present-day Basel, Aventicum, now Aventus, and Vindonissa, now Windisch. These cities became economic and cultural centers with temples, thermal baths, theaters, and well-developed infrastructure, and Roman rule led to significant advances in various fields. Agriculture was developed with Roman techniques, trade flourished, and Roman law and administration characterized society. The indigenous Celtic population gradually adopted the Roman way of life, and Latin became the dominant language, while the Roman road network, an important trade route, also contributed to economic development and facilitated the transportation of goods and troops. In the 3rd century AD, however, the Roman Empire came under increasing pressure. Germanic tribes, notably the Alemanni, repeatedly invaded the region and threatened Roman control. The Romans responded by building fortifications along the Rhine, but the attacks continued to increase. In the 4th and 5th centuries, what is now Switzerland was increasingly overrun by Germanic tribes. With the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Roman rule in the region ended. The remaining Roman structures fell into disrepair, and Germanic peoples, including Burgundians and Alemanni, settled in Switzerland. However, the Roman period left deep traces that are still visible today. The remains of Roman towns, road networks, and buildings testify to Switzerland's Roman past and its integration into one of the most powerful empires in history, migration of Germanic tribes. During this period, various Germanic tribes migrated to the region and gradually took over the territory. The two most important groups were the Alemanni and the Burgundians, who settled in different regions and permanently changed the cultural and social fabric of Switzerland. The Alemanni were a Germanic tribe from what is now southwestern Germany that repeatedly attacked the Roman border region on the Rhine and briefly occupied parts of the Roman provinces in the 3rd and 4th centuries. After Roman rule in Switzerland finally collapsed in the 5th century, the Alemanni settled permanently in the northern and eastern parts of Switzerland, especially in what is today the Central Plateau and German-speaking Switzerland. They initially lived in a peasant society with a decentralized tribal structure, and only gradually adopted Roman influences. Latin, which was widely spoken during Roman rule, gave way in these regions to Alemannic, which became the basis of modern Swiss German. The Burgundians, on the other hand, settled in the west of present-day Switzerland, especially in the Rhone Valley and the Lake Geneva region. Originally living in Scandinavia and later in Central Europe, they were settled by the Romans in western Switzerland as federations, i.e. allied settlers. In 440, they founded their own kingdom, centered on Geneva and Lausanne, initially under Roman influence, but gradually becoming independent. The Burgundians adopted many Roman traditions, including Latin law and administration. While the migration of Germanic tribes led to the cultural and linguistic division of Switzerland, the Latin language also remained widespread in their territory, which influenced the later development of French-speaking Switzerland. While the Alemanni settled the Germanic language in the north and east, the west remained Romanized and later became a French-speaking region. This dichotomy between Germanic and Romansh influences still exists today and is one of the main linguistic and cultural features of Switzerland, and the integration of new settlers has not always been peaceful. In some areas, conflicts have arisen between the Germanic tribes and the remaining Romani population. However, centuries of coexistence led to a gradual fusion of traditions, especially in the west, where Burgundian and Roman influences were mixed, and the political structures of the Germanic tribes evolved over time, and their territories were later integrated into the Frankish Empire, which took control of the region in the 6th century under King Chlodwig. The migration of the Alemanni and Burgundians thus marked the transition from Roman to medieval history in Switzerland. Their settlements and traditions laid the foundations for the country's later cultural diversity and had a significant influence on the linguistic and social development of Switzerland. The 8th and 9th century Carolingian period was a formative one. During this period, the region was integrated into the Frankish Empire, which became the dominant power in Western Europe under Charlemagne. The Carolingian rule brought significant changes to the political organization, society, and culture of the region, and by the 6th century, what is now Switzerland was under the control of the Merovingian Frankish Empire. However, with the decline of the Merovingians, the Carolingians took power under Pepin the Younger and later his son Charlemagne. Charlemagne defeated the Lombards in Italy in 786, securing the southern Alpine passes that were crucial for trade and military control and making Switzerland a strategically important part of the Frankish Empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to Central Europe. Charlemagne carried out a sweeping administrative reform that also affected the area that is now Switzerland. The region was divided into counties ruled by royal officials, called counts, who were directly subordinate to the king and charged with maintaining order and justice. The local population consisted mainly of free peasants, but there were also serfs who worked on the estates of nobles or the church. Christianization, which had already begun in Roman times, was furthered under Charlemagne, and monasteries played a central role. The Abbey of St. Gall in particular became an important intellectual and cultural center. The Benedictine Abbey of Galen became one of the most important monasteries in the empire and played a key role in missionary work and public education. Economic structures also changed during the Carolingian period. Trade and agriculture developed further and new transportation routes emerged. The Alpine passes, especially the Great St. Bernard, became increasingly important for the movement of goods and people between Italy and the rest of the Frankish Empire. After Charlemagne's death in 814, the Frankish Empire was divided among his successors, which led to increased political tensions. With the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire was divided into three, with most of the territory of present-day Switzerland being part of Lothar I's Middle Kingdom, but later passing to the East Frankish Empire, which formed the basis of the Holy Roman Empire. With the rise of the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century, the territory of present-day Switzerland became an integral part of this political entity, which for centuries covered a large part of Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was founded under Otto of Abir, who was crowned emperor in 966. The empire saw itself as the successor of the ancient Roman Empire and united numerous principalities, duchies, counties, and bishoprics under a loose imperial administration. Switzerland at this time was not an independent territory, but consisted of various dominions ruled by local noble families, bishops, and monasteries. In the 12th century, the Dukes of Zähringen were particularly influential, controlling much of present-day Switzerland and founding numerous towns such as Bern, Fribourg, Uchtland, and Murten. These towns quickly became economic and political centers, and the Zähringen family, as well as other noble families, played an important role. While the Counts of Savoy dominated western Switzerland, the Habsburgs gained increasing influence in eastern and central Switzerland. Originally from Argau, the Habsburgs would later play a central role in European history, and the Holy Roman Empire was characterized by a close link between church and state. Bishops and abbots often wielded secular power and ruled over vast territories. The Abbey of Einsiedeln and the Abbey of St. Gall in particular were important religious and cultural centers, promoted education and agriculture, and played a decisive role in Christianization and missionary work in the region. The population was predominantly agricultural. The Alpine region was characterized by animal husbandry, while agriculture was carried out in the lower regions, but trade increased, especially through the strategically important Alpine passes, such as Gotthard, which linked northern and southern Europe. In the 13th century, imperial power in the Holy Roman Empire began to decline, and emperors became increasingly dependent on the support of princes who acted more and more independently. As a result, local aristocratic families and towns in Switzerland also strived for greater independence. The growing influence of the Habsburgs led to tensions with the rural areas of central Switzerland who wanted to defend their freedom, and these conflicts would later lead to the formation of the former Swiss Confederation, which rebelled against Habsburg rule. 1291 Confederation. In 1291, the three original cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden signed an alliance for mutual support. This agreement, later known as the Federal Charter of 1291, is considered the fundamental founding act of the Swiss Confederation, and emerged at a time when the inhabitants of the Alpine region wanted to secure their right to self-determination against external power claims, especially the Habsburgs, who were gaining increasing influence in the region. The Federal Charter was a pledge for mutual assistance and peaceful conflict resolution between the participating regions. The first cantons promised to settle disputes by arbitration, not by force, and not to accept foreign judges who did not come from the region. In this way, the alliance partners maintained a certain independence from outside powers. There were many reasons for the alliance. First, the three cantons were closely linked economically and geographically. They were located on important trade routes through the Alps, especially the Gotthard Road, a central link between northern and southern Europe. Control of these trade routes was of strategic importance, so both the local communities and the Habsburgs were interested in exerting influence over the region. Imperial power had weakened, and the Habsburgs, who came from Argau as counts, sought to consolidate their control over central Switzerland. This led to tensions with free peasants and rural communities who wanted to preserve their traditional rights and freedoms. The Confederation of 1291 was therefore a reaction to this threat and an attempt to secure their independence. Although the Federal Treaty was only a local alliance between the three cantons, it laid the foundations for the later development of the Confederation. In the decades that followed, other regions joined the alliance, cooperation between the cantons intensified, and the idea of a common defense alliance based on mutual protection and autonomy became the basis of Swiss identity. Subsequently, the history of the founding of the Confederation was largely mythologized. The story of William Tell, the Rütli Oath, and the struggle against Habsburg rule became part of national historiography, and these myths played an important role in the formation of Swiss identity, especially in the following centuries when the Confederation further consolidated its political independence. The Battle of Morgarten. The Battle of Morgarten in 1315 was a decisive moment in the early history of the Swiss Confederation. In this conflict, Confederate troops defeated Habsburg forces and consolidated their independence, and the Confederation's victory over one of the most powerful noble families of the Holy Roman Empire became an important symbol of Switzerland's struggle for freedom. The conflict between the Habsburgs and the Confederates had deep roots. The Habsburgs had long sought to extend their influence into the central Alpine regions, but the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden had already united to defend their autonomy in the Confederation of 1290. The people of Schwyz in particular were at the center of the conflict, as they defended themselves against Habsburg territorial claims. When King Frederick the Fair of the House of Habsburg tried to assert his claim to power over the region with military force, a decisive battle ensued. The Habsburg army of several thousand heavily armored knights and infantry marched from Zug towards Schwyz. The Habsburg troops believed that they could quickly defeat the poorly equipped peasant armies of the Confederates. However, the Confederates used the geographical conditions to their advantage and set up an ambush at the Morgarten Pass, a narrow valley between Lake Ageri and the steep slopes of the surrounding mountains. When the Habsburg army reached the narrow pass, it was caught in a trap. The Confederates hiding on the surrounding slopes disorganized the knights by suddenly sending rocks and tree trunks into the Habsburg ranks, and the Confederates then attacked the enemy troops with pikes, battle axes, and clubs. The heavily armored Habsburg knights, barely able to maneuver in the rough terrain, had little to counter the fast and agile fighting style of the Confederates. Within a short time, the Habsburg army was crushed, and many knights died in the chaos or drowned in Lake Agaris. The victory at Morgarten had far-reaching consequences. It proved that Confederate troops, although largely composed of peasants, could defeat a highly armed army of knights. The successful defense against the Habsburgs strengthened the Confederate troops' self-confidence and led to the further consolidation of their alliance. Just 1 year after the battle, the First Cantons renewed their alliance in the Federal Treaty of 1316, thus laying the foundations for the further expansion of the Confederation. The Battle of Morgarten also heralded a fundamental change in warfare. While the European Middle Ages were characterized by the dominance of chivalry, the Confederate victory proved that well-organized foot troops were a powerful alternative to heavily armored knights in difficult terrain, and this tactic was further developed in later Confederate campaigns, making Swiss mercenaries the sought-after warriors throughout Europe for centuries to come. Morgarten also played an important role in Switzerland's commemorative culture. For centuries, the battle was depicted as a symbol of the Confederate soldiers' desire for freedom, and in the 19th century, when modern Switzerland emerged, it was often romanticized and used as a testament to the courage and cohesion of the first Confederate soldiers. Today, the Morgarten Monument on Lake Ageri commemorates this historic battle, considered one of the Confederation's first major victories over a major European power. The Battle of Sempach. In this battle, Confederate troops once again defeated the Habsburgs, further consolidating their independence and supporting the expansion of the Confederation. The victory over the Habsburg knightly army demonstrated that the Confederation had become a military power to be taken seriously and ushered in a period of territorial and political consolidation. The conflict between the Confederation and the Habsburgs had been developing for decades, with the Habsburgs, one of the most powerful noble families of the Holy Roman Empire, claiming a large number of lands in central Switzerland. However, the growing Confederation posed a direct threat to their rule. After the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, the Habsburgs were forced to temporarily withdraw, but their influence in the region remained strong. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Confederation expanded its network of alliances. Lucerne, which joined the Confederation in 1312, was particularly affected by Habsburg rule. Conflict escalated when Lucerne began attacking nearby Habsburg territories. Duke Leopold III of Habsburg then decided to enter central Switzerland with a large army to punish the rebellious Confederates and reassert his control over the region. Habsburg troops met the Confederates near the small town of Sempach on July 9, 1386. The Habsburg army consisted of heavily armed knights who relied on the strength, discipline, and superior weaponry of their armored infantry in a classic order of battle. The Confederates, on the other hand, were predominantly peasant warriors who fought with light baton lances and swords. Their tactics were based on speed, maneuverability, and the use of rough terrain, and the battle initially began with an attack by the Habsburgs, who advanced in closed ranks. However, the Confederates used their battle tactics skillfully. One of the most famous heroes of the battle was Arnold von Winkelried, who, according to legend, threw himself on the enemy's spears to create a gap in the Habsburg front through which his comrades in arms could advance. While it remains unclear whether this story is historically verifiable, it symbolizes the courage and willingness to sacrifice of Confederate soldiers. Thanks to their superiority in close combat, the Confederates were eventually able to break through the Habsburg ranks, and the heavily armored knights were left behind, unable to fight as usual on the narrow battlefield and in the intense heat. Many were killed, including Duke Leopold III himself, and after his death, the Habsburg troops panicked and fled. The Confederates pursued the fleeing enemies and caused a huge bloodbath that dealt a heavy blow to the Habsburgs. The consequences of the Battle of Sempach were far-reaching, and the Confederate victory shook the Habsburg power in the region and consolidated the independence of central Switzerland. In the following years, other cities and regions joined the Confederation, including Zug and Glarus. The Confederation's expansion was significantly accelerated by this military success, and the Battle of Sempach was further proof of the Confederation's military tactics, which relied on well-coordinated foot units rather than heavily armored knights. The Sempach experience would play an important role in later battles, especially in the Burgundian Wars of the 15th century. The Burgundian Wars. The Burgundian Wars, which lasted from 1474 to 1477, are a decisive episode in Swiss history. During these years, the Confederates were in military conflict with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. While Charles was trying to expand the Duchy of Burgundy and incorporate Switzerland into his sphere of influence, the Confederates were striving for independence and wanted to prevent the powerful Burgundy from controlling their territory. The origins of the Burgundian Wars lie in Charlemagne's ambitious plans to create a great kingdom encompassing what is now France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Through numerous military conquests and diplomatic alliances, Charles had established the Duchy of Burgundy as a major power in Western Europe, but its expansion brought it into constant conflict with the Swiss cantons, who wanted to preserve their territorial integrity on the one hand and expand their influence in the region on the other. The first decisive battle in this war took place at Grauncin in 1476. Charles the Bold had gathered an army to defeat the Confederates who opposed his expansion, but despite its military superiority, the Burgundian army was surprisingly defeated by the Confederates. This victory was crucial in demonstrating the military superiority of the Confederacy over Charles's heavily armed troops. The Battle of Grauncin led to the recapture of the town and a massive loss for the Burgundians. The Burgundians not only won the battle, but also took valuable spoils of war, including the entire Burgundian fleet. The military success at Grauncin strengthened the resistance of the Confederates, but Charles the Bold did not give up and tried to recoup his losses. In the summer of 1476, he again marched against the Confederates, this time around Merton, where the two armies met again. The Confederates once again fought successfully against the Burgundians at the Battle of Merton, which took place on June 22, 1476, and despite the numerical superiority of the Burgundian troops, the Confederates were able to defeat the enemy army thanks to their tactics and training in the use of pike and hellebarde. This victory was particularly important as it put an end to Burgundian expansion plans in Switzerland and laid an important foundation for the future independence of the Confederation. The war finally ended in 1477 with the decisive defeat of Charles the Bold at the Battle of Nancy. Still seeking revenge after the defeats at Grauncin and Merton, Charles once again marched against the Confederacy in an attempt to assert his influence. In this final battle, however, he was defeated and killed by a coalition of Confederate troops and French soldiers. With Charles's death, the threat from the Duchy of Burgundy ended, and the Confederacy was able to secure its independence. The consequences of the Burgundian Wars were far-reaching for Switzerland. On the one hand, the Confederates were able to preserve their territorial integrity and prove their independence against major European powers such as Burgundy and France. On the other hand, the victory led to an expansion of the Confederation's territory, as the Confederation took advantage of the victories in the wars to gain territories such as the Duchy of Franche-Comté and the Burgundian dominions. These territorial expansions were decisive as they further increased the Confederation's influence in Western Europe and strengthened its position in the political relations of the late Middle Ages. The Swabian War of 1499 was the culmination of a series of tensions between the Confederation and the Empire that had arisen repeatedly in previous years. The causes of the Swabian War lie in the continued expansion and desire for independence of the Confederation, which increasingly wanted to break free from the fiefdom of the Emperor and the Empire. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Confederation was a powerful military alliance that included many of the cantons of present-day Switzerland. However, these cantons were still officially under the Holy Roman Empire, and the Emperor had repeatedly tried to regain control over the Confederates. The first cause of war was a dispute between the Confederates and the Duke of Swabia, who was also acting as the Emperor's representative. The Confederates, especially the cantons of Uri, Schwutz, and Unterwalden, which played a key role in the formation of the Confederation, resisted attempts to curtail their independence. These tensions came to a head in 1499 when the Holy Roman Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Maximilian S., sent troops to Switzerland and once again tried to bring the Confederates under its rule. In the spring of 1499, an army of the Holy Roman Empire entered Switzerland and the Swabian War began. The Confederates, who had gradually established themselves as a powerful military force, met the Emperor's troops with a united front. The Confederates relied on their proven fighting, based on quick and effective attacks and close cooperation between the various cantons, and their ability to coordinate and deploy well-trained soldiers with in-depth knowledge of warfare gave them decisive advantages. The decisive battle of the war was the Battle of Dornach in July 1999. In this decisive battle, the Confederates defeated the troops of the Holy Roman Empire, forcing them to retreat. This defeat was a heavy blow for Emperor Maximilian I, whose troops were waiting for military and logistical support from other parts of the empire. The Confederate victory led to a quick end to the war and sent a strong signal of independence for Switzerland. The Swabian War ended with the Peace of Basel, signed in September 1499, which de facto recognized the independence of the Confederation. The Holy Roman Empire had to come to terms with the fact that Switzerland was now practically independent, although still subordinate to the empire in some official matters. The confederations could now make their own political and military decisions independently, without direct interference from the emperor or the empire, and the Swabian War had far-reaching consequences for Swiss history. The military successes and the Peace of Basel not only consolidated the independence of the Confederation, but also helped to strengthen the self-confidence of the Swiss as an independent political and military entity. The war demonstrated that Switzerland could assert itself and successfully defend its interests against one of Europe's greatest powers, and the Swabian War further strengthened the Confederation. The cantons, already working together in joint military efforts, strengthened their political and economic ties after the war. The victory over the Holy Roman Empire contributed to the recognition of Switzerland as a sovereign and independent nation, and the Confederation further consolidated its territorial and political structures in the following centuries. The 16th century Reformation was a religious and social movement that significantly affected Switzerland and changed religious life in Europe. Under the leadership of Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich and John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland became an important center of the Reformation and influenced not only the religious, but also the political and cultural structures of Switzerland. Huldrych Zwingli, a Catholic priest, began his Reformation activities in Zurich in 1519. Zwingli was inspired by the Christian idea of a direct and personal relationship between the believer and God, and questioned the authority of the Catholic Church. In particular, the practice of selling indulgences and the church hierarchy, which he considered corrupt and unbiblical, were the main points of criticism for Zwingli. Zwingli preached that the Bible was the only source of religious truth, and that the Pope and the Church had no special authority over believers. This radical stance led to an increasing conflict with the Catholic Church and the establishment of a new Protestant theology based on the principles of the New Testament. Zwingli's ideas spread rapidly in Zurich, and in 1523, a speech on religious reform was delivered in which Zwingli and his followers laid out the principles of the Reformation. The Zurich congregation accepted a series of reforms that eventually led to the abolition of sacred worship, liturgy, and fasting, and Zurich churches were equipped with plain Bibles and simple decorations instead of altars and religious pictures. Zwingli also introduced the Zurich Church Order, which reorganized spiritual life in Zurich and placed a stronger emphasis on the preaching of the gospel, while another current of the Reformation developed in Geneva under John Calvin. Calvin, who fled France in 1536 and settled in Geneva, pursued an even more radical reformist agenda. In his Institutio Christianae Religionis, he laid the foundations for Calvinism, a strict form of Protestantism based on the idea of predestination, the belief that God determines from the beginning who will be saved. Calvin wanted strict church discipline and the absolute authority of the Bible to be enforced by the congregation through church order. In Geneva, Calvin established a strict theocratic government in which church and city government were closely linked. The Geneva Reformation led to the creation of a Puritan society with a strict moral code. Calvin preached that believers should lead a life of strict humility and piety, reflected in the lifestyle of the people of Geneva. Geneva soon became the center of Calvinism, and from there, Calvinist ideas spread to other parts of Europe, especially France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. In Switzerland, the Reformation led to a deep religious division, with Zurich and Geneva becoming centers of Protestantism, while the Catholic population in many Catholic mountain cantons and other parts of Switzerland remained loyal to the traditional Roman Catholic Church. These religious tensions led to repeated clashes between Protestant and Catholic regions. In particular, the Kappel War of 1529 and 1531, which saw armed clashes between Catholic and Reformed cantons, demonstrated the growing importance of religious issues for the political and social order in Switzerland. Despite these conflicts, the religious structure of Switzerland stabilized throughout the 16th century, with some cantons remaining loyal to Protestantism and others to Catholicism. Later, this led to a sectarian division in Switzerland, with long-term political repercussions. In the 16th and 17th centuries, religious differences shaped alliance politics and foreign policy, as Switzerland increasingly played a role in conflicts between the Catholic and Protestant powers of Europe. The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, began as a religious dispute between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. but quickly developed into an international conflict involving many European powers. While most European countries were involved in the war, Switzerland managed to remain largely neutral and stay out of the military conflict. At the start of the 30 Years' War, Switzerland was of great importance as a strategic location between the various warring parties, but the country was in a particularly difficult situation as Switzerland was made up of several cantons with different denominations, some Protestant and others Catholic. These religious tensions could theoretically have led to intervention in the conflict, since the war was strongly characterized by sectarian disputes. However, Switzerland decided to maintain its neutrality and not intervene in the war. Another important factor in Switzerland's neutrality was the domestic political situation. At the time of the 30 Years' War, Switzerland was strongly characterized by its federal structure, where the cantons were largely autonomous and in most cases refused to intervene in international conflicts. Some of the southern and western cantons had close ties with Catholic forces, while the northern and western Swiss cantons were Protestant. These religious and political differences meant that there was no common stance against war within Switzerland, which prevented direct military intervention. Switzerland's decision to remain neutral was also supported by foreign policy factors. During the 30 Years' War, many European powers sought the support of neutral countries to advance their interests, and Switzerland benefited from maintaining its independence and neutrality by staying out of the military conflict and instead acting as a mediator and trading partner for many European countries. This ensured that Switzerland was largely unscathed during the war and did not suffer major military destruction. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which officially ended the 30 Years' War, had far-reaching consequences for Switzerland, which was recognized as an independent and sovereign state under international law during the negotiations. This treaty, considered one of the most important in European diplomacy, laid the foundation for Switzerland's long-term policy of neutrality. The Peace of Westphalia ensured that Switzerland would no longer be involved in political and military conflicts in the rest of Europe and recognized its independence as a separate nation. The recognition of Switzerland's independence in the Peace of Westphalia was of paramount importance for the future development of the country. It led not only to permanent neutrality, but also to greater political stability within Switzerland. The peace enabled the country to further develop its internal order and federal structures without getting involved in international conflicts, and this policy of neutrality became an integral part of Swiss foreign policy and largely spared the country from wars and military conflicts in the centuries that followed. The Helvetic Republic. The Helvetic Republic, which existed from 1798 to 1703, was a decisive moment as it radically changed the traditional system of the former Swiss Confederation. The impact of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, strongly characterized this period and led to fundamental political upheavals in many European countries, including Switzerland, which prior to the creation of the Helvetic Republic was a loose confederation of independent cantons linked by the Confederation, but acting largely autonomously. The beginnings of the Helvetic Republic were closely linked to military and political events in Europe. In 1798, revolutionary French troops led by Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Switzerland, and the advance of the French army was fueled by dissatisfaction with the existing system in Switzerland. There were internal conflicts and social tensions in many parts of the country as various cantons and regions pursued different interests. Especially in the cities and among the wealthy bourgeoisie, there was sympathy for the ideas of the French Revolution, such as equality before the law and the rejection of feudal structures. And the French invasion led to the dissolution of the old Confederation and the creation of a new centralized state under the supervision of French revolutionaries. On April 12, 1798, the Helvetic Republic was officially proclaimed, and the new state had a centralized constitution that concentrated power largely in the hands of a national government. This was in stark contrast to the previous decentralized confederation structure in which the cantons enjoyed wide autonomy. This change led to major political tensions, as many cantons resisted centralization and traditional privileges were lost. In particular, the Catholic canton of Uri and other rural mountain cantons rejected the reforms and resisted the new government. However, the Helvetic Republic was characterized by instability from the very beginning. The central government struggled to maintain control over the whole country, and there were numerous uprisings and unrest, mostly led by those who rejected the new system, including the Rutli Association, which opposed French rule and the centralization of power. Switzerland was thus a land of conflict and political uncertainty during this period. Moreover, the French presence in Switzerland was decisive not only militarily, but also politically. Switzerland was de facto a satellite state of France, and Napoleon had a significant influence on its internal politics. The Helvetic Republic was also affected by economic problems. Constant wars caused by the French occupation and ongoing tensions with conservative forces in the country led to a weak economy, while constant changes in the political order and poor governance made economic stability difficult. Despite these difficulties, some elements of the new order persisted, notably the introduction of the French Civil Code, the Code Civil, which formed the basis of Switzerland's legal system and brought the country closer to the principles of the French Revolution. The Mediation Act. The Mediation Act of 1803 was a decisive moment that stabilized the political situation in the country. Switzerland, under pressure from Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor at the time, had to find a new political order that preserved the country's federal traditions, while at the same time securing French influence. The context for this change lay in the years following the French invasion in 1798 and the subsequent creation of the Helvetic Republic. This republic was a centralized state, but faced resistance from many sectors of the population because it severely restricted the autonomy of the cantons. After the failed centralization of the Helvetic Republic, characterized by internal conflicts and political unrest, Napoleon decided to find a new solution for Switzerland. In 1803, he issued the Act of Mediation, a mixture of federal elements and Napoleonic influence. This constitution attempted to maintain the political balance between the various cantons by re-establishing the federal character of Switzerland, but at the same time, it continued to give France a significant influence over Swiss politics. The Mediation Act brought a return to the federal structure that existed before the Helvetic Republic. Switzerland was once again divided into cantons, which numbered 19. These cantons retained a certain degree of autonomy and were able to manage their own local affairs, while at the same time a centralized government was established under the supervision of France, making Switzerland dependent on Napoleon. A head of state called the First Consul was appointed, elected from the cantons, but always reflecting French influence. An important aspect of the Act of Mediation was that it returned a certain amount of power to the various social and political forces in Switzerland and restored the local and regional power of the cantons, which had been severely curtailed by the Helvetic Republic. In return, Switzerland secured its neutrality and essentially allied itself with Napoleon and France, which provided Switzerland with a degree of protection during the Napoleonic Wars. The Mediation Act also included a number of legal and social reforms inherited from the French Revolution, including the enactment of the French Civil Code, Code Civil, which was implemented in Switzerland and modernized the country's legal system. These reforms not only promoted Swiss unity, but also contributed to the creation of a standardized legal system that put the country on a new footing. However, the Mediation Act was not without its drawbacks. It was a compromise between Switzerland's traditional federal structures and the need to give Napoleon some control over the country. France retained the right to intervene militarily in Switzerland and also exerted influence over the country's foreign policy. While Switzerland officially retained its independence, it was heavily dependent on Napoleon politically and militarily, which led to the enactment of the Mediation Act being seen as a transitional phase in the years following its enactment, giving Switzerland a more stable but still French-influenced status in the decades to come. After the Napoleonic Wars that shook Europe for years, the leading powers of the continent met in Vienna to restore political order after the fall of Napoleon. The Congress, which took place between September 1814 and June 1815, aimed to restore geopolitical stability in Europe and reorganize the territorial boundaries of European states. The Congress of Vienna was of particular importance for Switzerland, as it formally recognized the country's permanent neutrality. Switzerland had played an important role as a neutral state during the Napoleonic Wars, and it was in the interest of the major European powers to guarantee this neutrality after the end of the war. This meant that Switzerland could not be drawn into future conflicts between other nations, and its independence would be respected by the major European powers. This was one of the key provisions that permanently influenced Switzerland in the international context and remains an important part of Swiss foreign policy to this day. In addition to recognizing neutrality, the Congress of Vienna also defined Switzerland's borders. The country had undergone territorial changes under Napoleon, and Switzerland was in political turmoil after the wars. The agreements reached at the Congress confirmed the country's status quo as a neutral, independent state, and a particularly important point was the final definition of Switzerland's borders. Switzerland retained its mountainous location as a natural border to other countries. During these agreements, the Treaty of Alliance was also signed between Switzerland and the Great Powers, which established Switzerland as a neutral state in Europe. Another important outcome of the Congress of Vienna was the recognition of the Swiss Confederation as a unified state composed of several cantons, which had previously been very different and independent in terms of their political and legal organization. The Congress of Vienna helped to strengthen the unity of Switzerland as a confederation of states and to promote a common political identity. This laid the foundations for the later development of modern Switzerland, which gradually evolved into a federal state with a strong policy of neutrality in the 19th century. Despite the positive outcomes for Switzerland, there were also challenges arising from political restructuring. Some neighboring countries, notably France and Austria, had their own interests in Switzerland and tried to exert their influence. But thanks to its neutrality and the support of the Great Powers, Switzerland was able to largely stay out of the political tensions in Europe. The Congress of Vienna recognized Switzerland's neutrality not only as a principle for Switzerland itself, but also as a model for other states wishing to avoid war and military force. The Sonderbund War. The Sonderbund War of 1847 was a conflict between conservative and liberal forces in the country, and in the mid-19th century, Switzerland was highly polarized politically. While the liberal cantons pushed for a stronger central government and the implementation of modern democratic principles, the predominantly Catholic and tradition-bound conservative cantons fought to maintain their autonomy and preserve the old federalist order. The political and religious tensions that emerged in the wake of the revolutionary movements in Europe in the 1830s and 1840s were rooted in conflict. The liberal movement, which found support especially in the urban and Protestant cantons, sought to reform the Swiss constitution. These reforms aimed to further centralize the country, reduce the power of the cantons, and expand the rights of the individual. But the conservative cantons, mostly Catholic and rural, feared that these reforms could endanger their religious and social traditions. The 1845 Constitution was particularly worrying for conservative forces because it was considered too liberal and not respectful enough of church authority. In 1845, a coalition of conservative cantons formed and called themselves the Sonderbund, a military and political alliance that opposed increasing centralization and liberal reforms. The Sonderbund consisted of 7 Catholic and conservative cantons that wanted to protect their political and religious interests. On the other side was the liberal majority of the other cantons, determined to break up the Sonderbund and impose a new constitution with a federalist orientation. The Sonderbund War broke out in November 1847, when the liberal government led by a Swiss general, Guillaume-Henri Dufour, decided that a military solution was needed to end the Sonderbund. The war was short and relatively bloodless, lasting only a few weeks. Despite the military superiority of the liberal cantons, the conservative cantons put up a belligerent resistance, and there were several battles, but the military defeat of the conservative troops was inevitable. On November 29, 1847, the conservative cantons surrendered, and the consequences of the Battle of Sonderbund were far-reaching. The war led to the dissolution of the Sonderbund and the final defeat of the conservative forces. Following the victory of the liberal cantons, far-reaching reforms were implemented that centralized Switzerland more strongly and strengthened the political power in the hands of the Confederation. The conflict not only resulted in the defeat of the conservative forces, but also marked the beginning of a new era in Swiss politics in which modern, liberal, and democratic principles gained importance. The Federal Constitution of 1848 followed the Sonderbund War of 1847, which deeply divided the country and made a political and social reorganization necessary. Following the victory of the liberal cantons and the defeat of the conservative forces, a new constitution was needed to pave the way for a more stable political structure and to pacify the various regional and ideological conflicts within Switzerland. The 1848 Federal Constitution transformed Switzerland from a loose confederation of sovereign cantons into a federal state with a centralized government. Previously, Switzerland had been a loose confederation in which the cantons enjoyed the greatest possible autonomy. However, this structure had been ineffective because it made national unity and political decision-making difficult. The federal state established in 1848 aimed to more tightly unify Switzerland and improve its ability to act at the international and national level. The new constitution established the Swiss Confederation as a federal structure in which the cantons largely retained their autonomy, but the federal authorities were responsible for central tasks. The 7-member executive body, the Federal Council, was created as Switzerland's central government unit, which would make decisions at the national level and guide national policy. At the same time, the parliament, known as the National Council, was created as a legislative body that would represent the interests of the people in federal policy. This meant that from that moment on, Switzerland had a system of separation of powers in which the various powers of the state were distributed among different institutions. The 1848 Federal Constitution also laid the foundations for citizens' rights and political participation. Among other things, it guaranteed civil liberties such as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and established a democratic system in which the people could elect their representatives at the national level in elections. These innovations made Switzerland one of the most progressive democracies compared to many other countries of its time, and an important aspect of the new constitution was the introduction of popular law. It gave citizens the right to submit popular initiatives to propose constitutional amendments and the right to hold referendums to vote on laws passed by parliament. These democratic elements became one of the most distinctive features of the Swiss political system and made the country a pioneer in the field of direct democracy. The 1848 Federal Constitution permanently stabilized the political situation in Switzerland and laid the foundations of modern Switzerland as a federal state with a strong central government. It helped establish Switzerland as a neutral, stable, and democratic state that would later play a special role in Europe and the world. Although the 1848 Constitution has been amended many times over time, it laid the foundation for modern Switzerland and its development in the 19th and 20th centuries. Economic boom. The economic boom in Switzerland in the 19th century was an important turning point in the country's history. The industrialization of Switzerland, which began at the end of the 18th century and was in full swing in the 19th century, transformed the Swiss economy from an agrarian society into a modern industrial society. These changes brought not only remarkable economic growth but also far-reaching social and societal upheavals. One of the main drivers of the economic upswing was the development of the textile industry, which played a particularly important role in central and eastern Switzerland, which had been predominantly agricultural before industrialization, and became a major textile manufacturing hub. This industry benefited from the introduction of new machinery and production methods, which enabled more efficient production and increased output enormously. The machinery industry also gained importance, and Switzerland became a major production center for machines and precision instruments. While another important factor in the economic rise was the development of the transport network, which laid the foundations for industrialization. The construction of railways throughout the 19th century played a key role in linking various parts of the country, facilitating the transport of raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets. The expansion of the transportation network not only contributed to economic integration, but also promoted trade and communication both within Switzerland and with other countries. Previously seen as a geographical barrier, the Alpine region became a transit route for international trade thanks to railway tunnels, such as the Gotthard Tunnel in the 1980s, and industrialization was accompanied by far-reaching social changes. Traditional agricultural labor structures began to dissolve, and more people moved to the cities to work in new factories and industrial plants. The growing cities, notably Zurich, Basel, and Geneva, experienced massive population growth, and while industrialization brought prosperity, it also brought new social problems, such as poor working conditions, child labor, and poor living conditions for workers. These grievances led to increasingly important social movements and workers' struggles in the 19th century, and the economic boom also led to an increasing specialization of the Swiss economy. As Switzerland grew as an industrial center, agriculture continued to play an important role, but there was a greater focus on exporting specialized products such as cheese, chocolate, and watches. The Swiss watch industry was particularly important due to the introduction of precision movements and the further development of innovative production techniques, and Switzerland established itself in international competition with its high quality and precision, which today form the basis of the worldwide reputation of Swiss watch brands. Industrialization and the economic boom of the 19th century made Switzerland one of the most prosperous countries in Europe. And despite the social challenges associated with the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society, the country managed to further expand its position as an economic and financial power. The prosperity of the 19th century also laid the foundations for Switzerland's political stability and social development in the 20th century, and contributed to the country's international recognition as one of the leading economic centers. Switzerland's neutrality in the First and Second World Wars was a central component of its foreign policy in the 20th century, and one of the foundations of its international identity. Unlike many other countries involved in devastating conflicts, Switzerland remained strictly neutral in both world wars and refrained from intervening. However, this neutrality was not a simple wait-and-see situation, but required a complex and often difficult balancing act between the belligerents who pursued their interests in Switzerland. During the First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, Switzerland was surrounded by belligerents. The Allies and the German Empire confronted each other in the West, the German Empire and the Russian Empire fought in the East, and the Italians were involved in the conflict in the South. Switzerland's geographical position between the warring parties made it a neutral territory used both as a refugee route and as a diplomatic channel. Switzerland hosted numerous diplomatic missions and was an important place for communication between the belligerent states, and international organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, headquartered in Geneva, also played an important role in humanitarian aid during the war. Despite its neutrality, Switzerland faced significant challenges during the First World War. Its borders had to be tightly controlled to prevent belligerents from using the country as a transit route for troops or as an intelligence base, and Switzerland was economically hampered by the belligerents, especially by the British naval blockade, which hampered Swiss trade relations. The supply situation was also difficult, and Switzerland had to deal with a rationing system to feed its population and keep its economy afloat. Switzerland also remained neutral during the Second World War from 1939 to 1945, but the situation was even more dangerous. The country was surrounded from the south, west, and east by the Axis powers, and the Nazi threat under Adolf Hitler was omnipresent. Switzerland was of great importance for the warring parties, both geographically and strategically, as it served as a transit country for goods and a transit route for military operations. The country was also an important financial center, where both the Allies and Axis powers managed their assets. But Switzerland's neutrality during the Second World War was not without problems. Faced with the military superiority of the Nazis, Switzerland not only abandoned official neutrality, but also adopted a policy of armed neutrality. The country prepared to defend itself by mobilizing its army and being ready to defend its borders in the event of an attack. Although Switzerland was never directly involved in the war, the policy of neutrality led to tensions with both sides. There were repeated accusations that Switzerland had developed economic ties with Nazi Germany, especially through the trade in gold and other raw materials, some of which came from war-torn countries. Switzerland also played an important role as a neutral mediator and humanitarian actor during the Second World War. Although not all refugees were accepted, it offered asylum to thousands of refugees, including many Jews fleeing the Nazis. Switzerland had strict immigration laws that rejected many refugees on political or racist grounds, and this policy was criticized after the war, not least for the role Switzerland played in financing and dealing with the Nazi regime. In sum, Switzerland's neutrality during the First and Second World Wars posed an enormous challenge and made the country a complex diplomatic actor in the midst of global conflicts. Although Switzerland stayed out of direct military conflicts in both world wars, the economic, political, and humanitarian burdens were enormous, and despite the challenges, Switzerland was able to maintain its independence and further expand its role as a diplomatic and humanitarian hub. Accession to the UN. Switzerland officially joined the United Nations on 10th September 2002, after a majority of the population voted in favor of accession in a 2002 referendum, marking a historic turning point in the country's foreign policy after many years of neutrality and restraint in international organizations. Although Switzerland has never been a member of the United Nations, it has played an important role as a host and mediator in international negotiations, notably through its role as the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva and the presence on its territory of numerous international organizations. The decision to join the UN was the result of a long process and a broad political debate, and Switzerland had traditionally pursued a policy of military and political neutrality, which had prevented it from joining many international organizations, including the United Nations. However, participation in the UN was increasingly seen as necessary to strengthen Switzerland's role on the international stage and increase its ability to influence global challenges such as climate change, international terrorism, and human rights abuses. At the same time, UN participation was not without controversy, seen as a way to integrate Switzerland into the international dialogue and further promote its humanitarian traditions. Critics feared that it could jeopardize the country's neutrality and draw it into international conflicts. There were concerns that Switzerland's membership might obligate it to participate in military or political actions that would violate the principles of neutrality. But these fears were allayed by the fact that Switzerland continued to maintain a policy of neutrality and did not feel bound by military conflicts that might occur within the UN framework. The referendum in 2002 was a decisive moment, as a majority of the population voted in favor of accession. The result reflected the Swiss desire to become more involved in international affairs while maintaining their neutrality, and joining the UN was seen as a confirmation of Switzerland's global responsibility and humanitarian values. Switzerland became a more active member of the international community and was able to continue its diplomatic and peace-building efforts at the global level through the United Nations. Another important outcome of joining the UN was Switzerland's increased role in peace-building, development assistance, and international cooperation, and since then Switzerland has further expanded its presence and influence at the UN, particularly in areas such as humanitarian aid, environmental policy, and human rights. Swiss delegations have actively participated in various UN organizations and have been represented in global debates and decision-making processes. To summarize, Switzerland's accession to the UN in 2002 was an important step in the country's foreign policy, reflecting both Switzerland's integration into the international community and its continued active role in global peace and security issues.